Some men believe they are the architects of their own universe. Emery Whitlock was one of them. Seated in the most exclusive restaurant in New York, with a woman half his age, and a Patek Philippe on his wrist that cost more than a house, he felt invincible. He had it all: the tech empire, the trophy girlfriend, the respect of his peers. He had traded in his old life for a better one, and his ex-wife Charlotte was just a forgotten chapter, a footnote in his meteoric rise. But what happens when the past doesn't just reappear, but walks in wearing a custom gown, radiating a confidence he's never seen, and on the arm of the one man Emery could never best? Tonight wasn't just a dinner. It was a reckoning, and the bill would cost him far more than money. The city of New York glittered below a sprawling galaxy of captured stars viewed from the 60th floor. From this vantage point, inside the hallowed, hushed interior of L'Étoile d'Or, the world felt like a meticulously crafted playset, and Emery Whitlock was its undisputed master. The clinking of crystal was a symphony dedicated to his success, the murmur of conversation a reverent hymn to the power gathered in this room. Every detail was perfect, curated to reflect his own image back at him, flawless, powerful, and astronomically expensive. Across the starched white linen, Tiffany Monroe beamed her smile as bright and flawless as the diamond necklace he'd gifted her that afternoon. She was the perfect accessory for this life, young, impossibly beautiful, with a delightful ignorance of the brutal mechanics of the world that Emery found both refreshing and affirming. She saw the empire, not the bodies buried in its foundations. Isn't it just divine, Emery? She breathed her eyes, sweeping across the opulent room. I saw on Vogue that even the Prime Minister of Spain couldn't get a reservation here last week. Emery allowed himself a small, self-satisfied smile. He probably didn't call the right person. He took a slow sip of the Chateau Margaux, a vintage that cost $4,000 a bottle. The wine was an investment, an experience something Tiffany would call yummy, but whose true value she couldn't possibly comprehend. Much like himself, he'd built his company Nexus Innovations from a garage startup into a global tech behemoth. He had outmaneuvered, out-hustled, and outsmarted every competitor. He was a shark in a world of minnows, and he had the scars and the billions to prove it. This life, this restaurant, this woman, they were his spoils of war. The war that had cost him his marriage. The thought of Charlotte surfaced, unbidden, a ghost at his feast. He pushed it down instantly. Charlotte Reed, his ex-wife, a woman who represented the before picture of his life. Sensible, quiet, intelligent in a way that was more academic than practical. She had been there in the garage, soldering circuit boards until her fingers were raw. She had believed in him when no one else did. But as his ambition grew, she had become an anchor. She spoke of ethics and work-life balance and spending time together. Quaint, antiquated notions that had no place in the stratosphere he was determined to reach. The divorce had been clinical. That's the word he used. He was generous, of course. He'd given her the suburban house they'd once called home, a stock portfolio that would ensure she never had to work again, and a lump sum settlement that his lawyers had called exorbitantly fair. He had, in essence, paid for her to disappear from his life, to fade into a comfortable, unremarkable obscurity. He imagined her now probably running a book club, maybe taking a pottery class. A quiet life for a quiet woman. It was for the best. She was a woman built for suburbia, not for the 60th floor. Did you hear what I said? Tiffany's voice, sharp with a hint of petulance, sliced through his thoughts. Sorry, darling. Lost in thought. I was saying that Candace got the new Hermes Birkin in crocodile. I'm simply dying for one. The taupe color is to die for. "We'll stop by the boutique tomorrow." He said the words automatic, the cost irrelevant. It was a simple transaction he provided, the luxury, she provided the adoration and the beauty, a far simpler arrangement than his marriage had ever been. He leaned back, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, the very picture of contentment. He had successfully excised the past. He had upgraded his life in every conceivable way. Charlotte was a memory, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of his ambition. He scanned the room, a king surveying his court. The mayor was in one corner, a banking tycoon in another. It was a gathering of eagles, and he was perched highest of all. His eyes drifted from table to table, a casual proprietary glance. And then they stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The low hum of the restaurant faded into a deafening roar in his ears. His breath caught in his throat, and the $4,000 wine suddenly tasted like ash. Across the expansive dining room, seated at a secluded corner table with the best view of the city, was Charlotte. It was her, but it wasn't. The mousy brown hair he remembered was gone, replaced by a sophisticated cut with warm, honeyed highlights that framed her face. The sensible blouses and practical skirts were gone, replaced by a simple but devastatingly elegant midnight blue gown that clung to her in a way that spoke of quiet confidence, not overt seduction. She wasn't wearing much jewelry, just a pair of understated diamond earrings that caught the light as she laughed. And it was the laugh that truly stunned him. It wasn't the polite, reserved chuckle he remembered. This was a genuine head-thrown-back laugh, full of a joy and lightness he hadn't seen in her for over a decade. Then he saw the man she was with. It wasn't some bland, middle-aged accountant she'd settled for. The man seated across from her, his attention entirely hers, was Vincent Beaumont. The Vincent Beaumont, CEO of Beaumont Holdings, a titan of industry whose family fortune was generations old. A man whose company, Nexus Innovations, had been trying to partner with for a year. A man Emery himself had failed to get a meeting with on 3 separate occasions. Vincent Beaumont, a legend in the world of global finance, was leaning forward, hanging on Charlotte's every word, a look of pure, unadulterated admiration on his face. And as Emery watched, frozen in a state of suspended disbelief, Vincent reached across the table and gently took her hand. The Patek Philippe on Emery's wrist suddenly felt like a lead weight. Its intricate mechanism, a marvel of Swiss engineering, seemed to mock the chaotic, sputtering failure of his own internal clock. Time had stopped. He stared, his mind struggling to process the scene, to fit this impossible tableau into the neat, orderly narrative he had constructed for his life. Charlotte, the woman he had dismissed as a relic of his past, was not in a pottery class. She was here, at l'Étoile d'Or, looking more vibrant and alive than he had ever seen her, and she was holding hands with Vincent Beaumont. "Emery, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," Tiffany said, her voice a sharp intrusion into his silent pandemonium. She followed his gaze across the room. "Oh, wow! That dress is gorgeous. Who is that?" Emery didn't answer. A cold knot of something unfamiliar and deeply unpleasant was tightening in his stomach. It wasn't just jealousy, it was a profound sense of dislocation, as if a fundamental law of his universe had just been proven false. He was the one who had ascended. She was the one who was supposed to have faded away. The script had been written by him. This was not in the script. He tried to find flaws. Her dress was elegant, yes, but perhaps too simple. Her hair was chic, but was it trying too hard? But the critiques died before they could form. She looked radiant. There was a serenity to her, a self-possession that was entirely new. The Charlotte he knew was often fraught with a quiet anxiety, a byproduct of living with a man whose ambition was a runaway train. This woman was perfectly still, perfectly centered, even as she laughed with one of the most powerful men in the country. "Do you know her?" Tiffany pressed a flicker of insecurity in her eyes. "She's pretty for someone older." "She's my ex-wife." Emery managed to say the words, feeling foreign and metallic in his mouth. Tiffany's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. "That's Charlotte, the one you said, the one who lives in New Jersey." "I assumed she still did." He muttered, his eyes still locked on the couple. He watched as a sommelier, a man who had approached Emery's own table with an air of near-divine reverence, practically bowed before Vincent and Charlotte. Vincent gestured for him to pour more wine, never taking his eyes off Charlotte. They were in their own world, a bubble of intimacy and shared amusement that felt impenetrable. What were they talking about? What could his quiet, bookish Charlotte possibly have to say that would so captivate a man like Vincent Beaumont? Emery's mind raced through a Rolodex of condescending possibilities. Was she telling him about her garden, her favorite novels? Was he simply slumming it, indulging a new, uncharacteristically plain romantic interest? That wasn't the look on Beaumont's face. It wasn't indulgence. It was respect. A waiter arrived with their appetizers, a delicate tower of seared foie gras for him, a glistening platter of oysters for Tiffany. The sight of the food turned his stomach. "Aren't you going to eat?" Tiffany asked, already daintily, sipping one of the oysters. "It's divine." "Not hungry." His voice was clipped. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over his contacts. He could call his private investigator. He could have a full dossier on Charlotte's life within the hour. Where she lived, who she saw, what she did. But something stopped him. It felt desperate. And Emery Whitlock was never desperate. Instead, he tried to play it cool, to regain control of the situation, at least within his own mind. He was Emery Whitlock. He was the headline. She was a footnote. This was a fluke, a statistical anomaly, a lucky date. Maybe she'd won a charity auction, a dinner with a CEO. Yes, that must be it. It was the only explanation that made sense, the only one that kept his world properly aligned. He took a large gulp of wine, the expensive liquid doing nothing to soothe the fire in his gut. He attempted to turn his attention back to Tiffany, who was now taking a selfie with her oysters, the flash a jarring burst of light in the dim restaurant. "The lighting in here is everything," she murmured, tapping away at her phone, adding filters. "Candace is going to be so jealous." Normally her vanity amused him. It was part of the package. But tonight it felt grating, vapid. He looked from Tiffany, pouting at her phone screen, to Charlotte, who was now engaged in an intense, quiet conversation with Vincent, her expression intelligent and focused. The comparison was a sudden, violent shock, like plunging into icy water. For the first time, he saw Tiffany not as a vibrant upgrade, but as a pale, one-dimensional caricature. He watched as Charlotte gestured with her hands, explaining something with an animation he hadn't seen in years. Vincent listened, nodded, and then replied, his own expression one of deep concentration. This was not a date. This was a meeting of minds. The cold knot in his stomach tightened into a fist of pure, unadulterated rage. Rage at her for being here. Rage at Beaumont for being with her. But mostly a terrifying, unfamiliar rage at himself for the dawning, horrifying realization that he may have made the biggest miscalculation of his entire life. He had to know. He couldn't just sit there and watch. The uncertainty was a poison seeping into his veins. He had to reassert his position, remind her and himself of the natural order of things. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly against the polished floor. "What are you doing?" Tiffany asked, looking up from her phone, her face a mask of confusion. "I'm going to go say hello," Emery said, his voice a low growl. "It's only polite." Walking across the plush carpet of L'Etoile d'Or felt like crossing a chasm. Each step was a deliberate, calculated effort to project an aura of casual confidence he was nowhere near feeling. The eyes of other diners followed him, recognizing the familiar face from magazine covers and news segments. He was a somebody. He had to remember that. He was Emery Whitlock. As he got closer, fragments of their conversation drifted towards him, snippets that made no sense. The beta test results were phenomenal. A 30% increase in processing efficiency. The firmware patch. Firmware processing efficiency. These weren't topics for a book club. He reached their table just as a wave of laughter subsided. Charlotte looked up and her eyes met his. For a split second, a flicker of the old Charlotte surfaced surprise, a hint of vulnerability. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a calm, neutral composure that was more unnerving than any anger would have been. "Emery," she said. Her voice was steady, even. Not a question, but a simple statement of fact. "Charlotte, fancy seeing you here," he said, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. He turned his attention to the man beside her, extending a hand. "Vincent, good to see you. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Emery Whitlock." Vincent Beaumont rose smoothly to his feet. He was taller than Emery had realized, with a quiet, commanding presence that didn't need to announce itself. He shook Emery's hand firmly. "Mr. Whitlock, of course, I know your work at Nexus. A pleasure." The words were polite, but his eyes were cool, analytical. They held no deference. "I've been trying to get a meeting with your team for months," Emery said, attempting a tone of breezy camaraderie. "Didn't realize all I had to do was get my ex-wife to put in a good word for me." He meant it as a joke, a subtle jab to put Charlotte back in her place, as an intermediary, a connector to him, not a destination in herself. But the joke landed with a thud in the silent air between them. Charlotte didn't flinch. She simply took a sip of her water, her expression unreadable. It was Vincent who responded, his voice smooth as silk. "Charlotte doesn't need to put in a good word for anyone. Her own work speaks for itself, and it speaks volumes." Emery's forced smile faltered. "Her work." He looked at Charlotte, a genuine, condescending curiosity in his eyes. "That's wonderful. Did you start that little catering business you always talked about?" He remembered those conversations, late at night in the early years when his own dreams were just sketches on a napkin. She had a passion for baking a flair for organization. She'd dreamed of opening a small, high-end catering company. He'd called it cute. Charlotte placed her glass down with a quiet click. "No, Emery. I didn't start a catering business." Before he could respond, Vincent gestured to the empty chair at their table. "Please don't let us keep you standing, though I imagine your companion is waiting for you." He said it with perfect politeness, but the message was clear. "You are an interruption." Emery ignored the implicit dismissal. He remained standing, a looming, awkward presence. "So what is this work that speaks volumes? Last I heard you were enjoying your retirement." The phrase came out laced with the same patronizing tone he'd used during their divorce proceedings. The memory of that day hit him with sudden clarity. They were in a sterile lawyer's office, the air thick with unspoken resentment. He had just signed the final papers, transferring the stocks, wiring the settlement. "This is more than enough for you to be comfortable for the rest of your life, Lottie," he'd said, using the old pet name like a weapon. "You won't have to worry about a thing. You can travel, take up a hobby. Just enjoy it." He had been giving her a golden parachute from a life she was no longer equipped to handle. He was the visionary, the builder. She had been his helpmate, but her role was complete. He saw the settlement not as a shared asset she was entitled to, but as a generous severance package for a long-serving but ultimately redundant employee. He remembered the look in her eyes that day. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was a strange, quiet fire he hadn't seen before. "Don't you worry about me, Emery," she had said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "I won't be just comfortable. I'll be fine." He had dismissed it as bravado, the last gasp of a proud woman trying to salvage some dignity. He'd even felt a pang of pity for her. What would she do with herself, without him, as her son? What would be the center of her orbit? Now, looking at her in the warm glow of l'Étoile d'Or, that pity curdled into a sickening unease. He had been so wrong. "Retirement didn't suit me," Charlotte said simply, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I decided to get back into the game. The game." Emery laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Charlotte, the game has changed since you were soldering motherboards in our garage. This is a different league." "Yes," Vincent Beaumont interjected his voice, cutting through Emery's condescension like a scalpel. "It is a different league, which is why it requires a different kind of player. Someone with vision. Someone who can see the flaws in the current architecture that the established players are too arrogant to notice." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, and they all hit their mark. Emery felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. He was one of those established players. Was Beaumont talking about him? "I'm not sure I follow," Emery said, his voice strained. Charlotte looked at Vincent, a silent communication passing between them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of deference. Vincent Beaumont was deferring to her. She turned her gaze back to Emery, and the serene mask dropped, revealing the steel beneath. "You know the settlement you were so proud of, Emery, the one you thought would buy me a lifetime of quiet obscurity." She began, her voice low, but carrying an incredible weight. "I didn't buy a villa in Tuscany. I didn't take up pottery." She leaned forward slightly, and for the first time that night, Emery felt a genuine tremor of fear. "I used it as seed money. I founded a company. It's called Ethelred Logic." The name meant nothing to him. It was just a strange, archaic-sounding word. "Ethelred Logic. What is that?" "Some kind of consulting firm." A slow smile spread across Charlotte's face, and it was the most terrifying thing Emery had ever seen. "Not exactly," she said. "We design and fabricate next-generation AI processing cores. We've developed a new proprietary architecture. It's faster, more efficient, and more secure than anything currently on the market." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Including the ones your company Nexus Innovations has been building its entire empire on for the past 5 years. The world tilted again, more violently this time. Emery felt a wave of vertigo so intense he instinctively gripped the back of the empty chair to steady himself. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the string quartet playing softly in the background, the distant laughter, it all warped into a dissonant, meaningless hum. AI processing cores, proprietary architecture, faster than anything on the market. The phrases slammed into his consciousness like wrecking balls. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a little business. This was a direct existential threat. Nexus Innovations' market dominance was built entirely on the speed and efficiency of its processing chips. They were the industry standard. They were his cash cow, his crown jewel. That's not possible." He stammered the words hollow. "That field requires hundreds of millions in R&D fabrication plants, a world-class engineering team. You can't just..." start a company like that with a divorce settlement. He was pleading, not just arguing, pleading with reality to reassert itself, to conform to the rules he understood. Charlotte's smile remained calm and unwavering. "You're right," she conceded. "You can't do it with just a settlement. But you can do it if that settlement gets you in the door. If it allows you to build a working prototype that's so undeniably revolutionary, it attracts the right kind of attention." She glanced at Vincent Beaumont, who was watching Emery with a dispassionate, almost clinical interest, like a biologist observing a specimen under a microscope. Vincent's firm, Beaumont Holdings, led our Series A funding round. She explained her tone as matter of fact, as if she were discussing the weather. They weren't the only ones interested. We were oversubscribed. Oversubscribed. The word was a punch to the gut. It meant a feeding frenzy. It meant that the smartest money in the world had seen her prototype and had been desperate to get a piece of the action. While he had been buying Tiffany diamond necklaces and flaunting his success, Charlotte had been quietly building a weapon aimed at the heart of his empire. "But your background is in electrical engineering from 20 years ago." He protested his mind, scrambling for a foothold. "You don't know AI architecture. You don't know fabrication logistics. You forget Emery," she said, her voice tinged with a faint, ironic sadness. "I was there when you built Nexus. I read every paper, every textbook you brought home. I was the one who debugged your initial code when you were ready to give up. I was the one who came up with the base algorithm for your first successful chip while you were out networking." A memory long buried and intentionally forgotten exploded in his mind. A late night years ago, coffee cups littering the desk in their small apartment. He was at a dead end, furious about to smash his keyboard. Charlotte, quiet and thoughtful, had looked over his shoulder at the screen full of code. "What if you rerouted the parallel processing queue through a recursive loop here?" she'd suggested softly. "It might reduce the latency." He had initially dismissed it, then tried it out of desperation. It had worked. It was the breakthrough that had become the foundation of their first patent. He had taken full credit. He'd told himself it was his idea, that she had just been a sounding board. "I never stopped learning," Charlotte continued, her voice pulling him from the disorienting flashback. "After the divorce, I had two things I hadn't had in years: time and money. I enrolled in postgraduate programs at MIT online, at first, then in person. I reconnected with old colleagues, brilliant minds who had been pushed out of big tech for being too disruptive. People you would have called difficult. I call them my executive team." He felt the blood drain from his face. She hadn't just used his money. She had used the very intellect he had once relied on, and then discarded. She had weaponized the part of her he had deemed unimportant. He looked from her to Vincent Beaumont, and suddenly their entire dynamic clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a date. This wasn't a CEO mentoring a plucky startup founder. The way Vincent looked at her, it was the look of a kingmaker who had found his queen. He wasn't just an investor. He was a true believer. Emery tried to regain his footing, to find his customary arrogance. "It's a tough market, Charlotte. Many have tried to challenge us. They've all failed." "They tried to compete with you," Vincent Beaumont said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "They tried to build a better version of what you already do. Ethelred logic isn't competing with Nexus, Mr. Whitlock. It's aiming to make it obsolete." Obsolete. The word hung in the air, a death sentence. "Now, if you'll excuse us," Vincent said, his tone signaling the finality of the conversation. "We have some projections to discuss." He picked up his wine glass and raised it to Charlotte. "To Ethelred," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "To Ethelred," she replied, her eyes meeting his over the rim of her glass. In that single shared glance, Emery saw it all: the partnership, the mutual respect, the shared vision. It was a connection far deeper and more powerful than any he had ever had with her or with anyone. They were partners, equals. He was dismissed, an irrelevance at their table. He turned and walked away, not with the confident stride of a king, but with the shuffling gait of a man who had just seen his own ghost. He stumbled back to his table, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. Tiffany was looking at him, her pretty face a mixture of impatience and concern. "What was that all about? You were over there forever? My oysters are getting warm." Emery sank into his chair. He looked at Tiffany, at her perfectly made-up face, her designer dress, her vapid expression, and he felt nothing. He looked at the half-eaten plate of foie gras, a symbol of a wealth that suddenly felt fragile and meaningless. He had thought he'd left Charlotte with a generous settlement. He had thought he was buying her silence. He now realized what he had actually done. He hadn't given her a golden parachute. He had given her the war chest she needed to destroy him. The rest of the dinner was a blur. Emery moved his food around his plate, the rich flavors of the duck confit turning to cardboard in his mouth. Tiffany's chatter about her friends, about shopping, about a planned trip to St. Bart's was a meaningless drone, the buzzing of a fly in a funeral parlor. His mind was a maelstrom of panic and disbelief, replaying the conversation at Charlotte's table on a loop, aiming to make it obsolete. He had built his identity on the foundation of Nexus innovations. He wasn't just a rich man. He was a visionary, a genius, the man who had revolutionized data processing. To be made obsolete wasn't just a financial threat, it was an existential one. If he wasn't Emery Whitlock, CEO of Nexus, who was he? As soon as they were in the back of his chauffeured Maybach, the silence of the car amplifying the frantic noise in his head, he pulled out his phone. His fingers, usually so deft on the touch screen, felt clumsy and thick. "What are you doing?" Tiffany asked, her tone accusatory. "You haven't said 2 words to me all night. You completely embarrassed me storming over there." "I'm busy," he snapped, not looking up from the screen. He typed Ethelred Logic into the search bar. The results were sparse, which was in itself terrifying. This wasn't a splashy consumer startup with a loud social media presence. This was a stealth operation. There was a minimalist corporate website. The landing page was stark, featuring only the company name and a single cryptic tagline, "Rethink Architecture." He navigated to the About Us page. There, under the heading Founder and Chief Technology Officer, was a professional headshot of Charlotte. It was the same woman from the restaurant, confident, poised, with an intelligent light in her eyes that the camera had captured perfectly. Her bio was concise and brutal in its efficiency. It mentioned her early work in microprocessing, her advanced degrees from MIT in artificial intelligence and quantum computing, and listed a dozen patents filed within the last 18 months, patents he had never heard of. Patents filed under her maiden name, Charlotte Reed. He clicked on the Board of Directors tab. The first name listed was Vincent Beaumont, Chairman. The other names were a who's who of tech royalty and venture capital legends. People he admired, people he had tried and failed to court for his own board. They had all bet on Charlotte. His heart pounded in his chest. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He kept digging, using his private access to financial news terminals. He found the filings for her Series A funding round. The numbers made him physically ill. Beaumont Holdings hadn't just led the round, they had poured in an astronomical sum. The total funding Ethelred Logic had raised was nearly $500 million. His generous settlement, the money he had used to discard her, was a rounding error in her new budget. It had been nothing more than the key that started a Formula One engine. "What is that?" Tiffany demanded, leaning over to look at his phone. She saw Charlotte's picture. "Are you seriously looking up your ex-wife right now, in front of me? What is wrong with you? You don't understand." He muttered, his voice hoarse. "This isn't what you think." "Oh, I think I understand perfectly." She shot back, her voice rising. "You're still obsessed with her. I knew it, the way you looked at her tonight. You go and buy me a $20,000 necklace, and for what? To sit there and drool over the woman you supposedly got over years ago." Her words barely registered. He was scrolling through a highly technical article in a niche industry journal that had just popped up in his search. The title was "The Ethelred Paradigm, a Quantum Leap in Neural Network Processing." The article detailed in highly technical jargon the theoretical basis for Ethelred Logic's new chip architecture. It described a system that didn't just improve on existing models, but fundamentally changed them using a hybrid approach that mimicked organic neural structures. It was brilliant. It was elegant. And if it worked as described, it would make his Nexus chips look like abacuses. The author of the paper was Dr. Charlotte Reed. He remembered her late at night, scribbling equations in notebooks he had dismissed as doodling. He remembered her talking excitedly about biomimicry and neural pathways, ideas he had called unrealistic and commercially unviable. He had crushed her intellectual curiosity under the weight of his own pragmatism. He hadn't just ignored her ideas, he had actively discouraged them, and she had taken them and built a silent bomb right under his throne. "Answer me, Emery!" Tiffany shrieked, her voice grating on his frayed nerves. "Is that what this is? Are you jealous that she's with that old guy?" "Old guy?" Emery laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "That old guy is Vincent Beaumont. He could buy and sell me 10 times over and not notice the transaction fee. And he's not just with her. He's backing her. She's my competitor." Tiffany stared at him, her anger momentarily replaced by confusion. "Her your competitor? What is she selling casseroles? It's a catering company, right?" The ignorance, the sheer cavernous gap between Tiffany's world and the reality that was currently crashing down on him was suddenly unbearable. The foundation of their relationship, his power, his wealth, her beauty, her adoration, had been a simple, clear transaction. But now his power felt illusory. His wealth was under threat, and her adoration based on that power felt worthless. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What? Get out of the car? Are you insane? We're on the FDR drive. You can't just kick me out here." "Frank," he barked at the driver through the intercom. "Pull over, now." The driver, a stoic man who had worked for Emery for years and had never heard him raise his voice, glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes wide. He expertly maneuvered the massive car to the shoulder. "Emery, you can't be serious," Tiffany cried, a note of real fear in her voice now. He turned to her, and she flinched from the look in his eyes. The charming, powerful billionaire was gone. In his place was a desperate, cornered animal. This evening was about me, celebrating my success, and all you could talk about was a handbag. Meanwhile, my entire world was just set on fire, and you're worried about your oysters getting warm. You are a distraction I can no longer afford. Get out." Tears welled in her eyes, smudging her perfect mascara. "But all my things are at your apartment." "I'll have them sent to you," he said coldly. "Now, get out." He pressed a button, and the door beside her unlocked with a soft click. For a moment, she just stared at him, her mouth agape. Then, with a sob of rage and humiliation, She scrambled out of the car, standing on the grimy shoulder of the highway, in her designer gown and heels, as cars whizzed past. Emery didn't look back. "Drive," he ordered the chauffeur. As the Maybach merged back into traffic, leaving Tiffany, a rapidly shrinking figure in the rearview mirror, Emery felt no satisfaction, no sense of control regained. He had shed a distraction, but the threat remained. He looked down at the phone in his hand, at the smiling, confident face of his ex-wife. He hadn't just lost a girlfriend. He had lost the plot. The narrative of his life, so carefully crafted, had been hijacked. He was no longer the hero of his own story. He was about to become the villain in hers. The days that followed the dinner at L'Étoile d'Or were a slow-motion demolition. Emery existed in a state of hyper-alert paranoia. He stalked the halls of his own company, the gleaming glass and steel tower of Nexus Innovations, but it no longer felt like his kingdom. It felt like a museum exhibit, a monument to a soon-to-be-extinct dynasty. He called an emergency meeting with his top engineers, the so-called geniuses he paid millions a year. He threw the technical journal featuring Charlotte's paper onto the polished boardroom table. "Ethelred Logic," he said, his voice tight. "What do we know?" Blank stares. A few of the senior researchers shifted uncomfortably. Finally, a young, ambitious engineer named Ben spoke up. "We've heard whispers, sir. Rumors of a new architecture out of a stealth startup. We flagged it for R&D a few months back, but..." "But what?" Emery demanded, his voice dangerously low. But the initial theoretical data seemed fanciful. Another senior engineer, a man named Peterson, whom Emery had headhunted from a competitor, chimed in. "It defied conventional models. We dismissed it as academic posturing, not commercially viable." Emery felt a surge of white-hot fury. Not commercially viable. The exact same words he had used to dismiss Charlotte's ideas all those years ago. His own short-sightedness, his own arrogance had been institutionalized. It had become company policy. "You dismissed it," Emery roared, slamming his fist on the table, making the water glasses jump. "You are paid to be visionaries, to anticipate the future, and instead you sat here getting fat and complacent, while my ex-wife was building the weapon that is going to slaughter us all." The room fell into a stunned, terrified silence. The mention of his ex-wife was a shocking breach of the professional wall Emery had always maintained. He spent the next week in a frantic, desperate scramble. He tasked his R&D department with a single objective replicate, Charlotte's work. He poured tens of millions of dollars into the effort, pulling engineers from other projects, demanding they work around the clock. The results were disastrous. The first reports that came back were filled with confusion. The Ethelred architecture wasn't an iteration, it was a revolution. It required a completely different way of thinking. His engineers, brilliant as they were like classical musicians being asked to play freeform jazz. They didn't have the instinct for it. They couldn't replicate the soul of the machine because they didn't understand the philosophy behind it. Worse, he discovered that 2 of his most promising young AI specialists had resigned 3 months ago. A quick, frantic check revealed they had both been hired by a newly funded logic firm in Boston, Ethelred. Charlotte wasn't just outthinking him. She was poaching his best talent from under his nose. She knew exactly who to target, because she had probably heard him praise their work at the dinner table years ago. She was using his own life against him. His personal life was in shambles. The news of him abandoning Tiffany on the highway had, of course, leaked to the tabloids. He was painted as a heartless monster, a narrative that his rivals gleefully amplified. His meticulously curated public image was cracking. He didn't care. Tiffany was a ghost, a symptom of the disease of his hubris. The real problem was Charlotte. He started seeing her everywhere, not literally, but in the architecture of his own life. He'd walk through the minimalist open-plan office of Nexus, an office design she had sketched on a napkin, once arguing it would foster collaboration, a design he had implemented years after she was gone and taken credit for. He'd use a piece of software whose user interface was based on principles of intuitive design she had championed. Her fingerprints were all over his success, and he had never not once acknowledged it. One evening, unable to sleep, he found himself in the vast walk-in closet of his penthouse. He pushed past rows of bespoke suits and found a dusty box tucked away in the back. Inside were relics from his before life, old photos, college yearbooks. He found a picture of him and Charlotte from their university graduation. He was thin, eager, a fire in his eyes. She was beside him, her arm linked through his, looking at him with a gaze of such profound belief and love that it physically hurt to see. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at him as if he were the only thing in the world. He remembered that day. He had just won a prestigious engineering award. "We did it, Lottie," he had said to her. When had we become I? When had he started to believe the myth of the self-made man, erasing her contributions from the story until even he forgot they had ever existed? The answer was clear. It happened slowly then, all at once. With every success he had taken a larger share of the credit. With every new round of funding, he had seen her as less of a partner and more of an accessory. He hadn't just divorced a woman. He had tried to erase a co-founder. A week later, the real bombshell hit. Ethelred Logic announced its first official product, the Ethelred 1 processing core, available for enterprise-level integration. They also announced their flagship launch partner, Beaumont Automotive, Vincent Beaumont's luxury electric car company. The press release stated that the Ethelred 1 chip would power their entire autonomous driving suite, making it the most advanced and responsive system in the world. Nexus had been aggressively courting Beaumont Automotive for 2 years, desperate to get their chips into that very system. It would have been their flagship entry into the automotive sector. They had been stonewalled at every turn. Now he knew why. Vincent wasn't just waiting for a better chip. He was waiting for Charlotte's chip. The market reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Nexus Innovations stock plummeted 30% in a single day. Billions of dollars of his net worth, his identity, his scorecard evaporated into thin air. His phone rang off the hook. His board members were demanding answers. His investors were panicking. That evening he sat alone in his vast, empty penthouse, the glittering city lights outside seeming to mock him. He poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He was no longer the king surveying his domain from the 60th floor. He was a man in a glass tower, watching a tidal wave approach, knowing the foundations were built on sand. He had thought the worst thing that could happen was losing market share. He was wrong. The worst thing was the crushing, soul-destroying realization that the woman he had deemed unworthy of his future was now undeniably the architect of his downfall. And she had done it, not with malice or revenge, but simply by being the brilliant person he had refused to see. 3 months later, the dust had not settled. It had coalesced into a new permanent landscape. The name Ethelred Logic was no longer a whisper in the tech world. It was a roar. Their chip wasn't just a success, it was a paradigm shift. Major cloud computing companies, server farms, and AI research labs were lining up desperate to integrate the Ethelred 1 core into their systems. Nexus was bleeding clients, and its stock was in a steady, agonizing decline. Emery had become a recluse. He'd stopped going into the office, managing his crumbling empire from the sterile confines of his penthouse. The board had held an emergency meeting where they'd stopped just short of demanding his resignation, instead installing a new COO to handle day-to-day operations, a polite coup. He was a king in name, only a figurehead on a sinking ship. He had lost weight. His expensive suits hung off his frame. The fire in his eyes had been replaced by a haunted, hollow look. He spent his days watching the financial news, each mention of Ethelred a fresh twist of the knife, and his nights staring at old photographs trying to pinpoint the exact moment he had made his catastrophic mistake. One afternoon his assistant buzzed him. "Sir, there's a package for you. A courier just dropped it off." "I'm not expecting anything," he mumbled. "It's from Ethelred Logic, sir." Emery's blood ran cold. "Bring it in." The package was a simple, elegant black box. There was no note. Inside, nestled in custom foam, was a single object. It was a silicon wafer about 8 inches in diameter, etched with hundreds of identical, incredibly complex microcircuits. He recognized it immediately. It was a production wafer of the Ethelred 1 chip. He picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. It was beautiful, a marvel of human ingenuity. He could see the revolutionary design in the patterns, the anechoic pathways, the dense clusters of neural-style processors. It was a work of art. It was the physical manifestation of Charlotte's genius. Tucked beneath it was a small, cream-colored card. On it was a single handwritten sentence. "I thought you might want to see what we built." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The "we" was a dagger. It was the word he had stolen from their shared past, and she was now using it to define her independent future. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't revenge. It was a simple, devastating statement of fact. This is what they had created, her and her new team. This was the future he had dismissed. He stood there for a long time, holding the wafer, the cold, smooth silicon, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his soul. He had spent his life believing that success was a zero-sum game, that for him to rise, others had to fall. He saw people as assets or liabilities, tools to be used, or obstacles to be removed. He had classified his own wife as a liability, and in doing so, had made the most profound error in judgment possible. Charlotte hadn't set out to destroy him. He saw that now. Revenge was too small a motive for a mind like hers. She had simply set out to build something new, to realize the potential he had tried to stifle. His destruction was merely a byproduct of her creation, an incidental consequence of her brilliance finally being unleashed. He had been standing in the way of progress, and progress had quite naturally rolled right over him. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking down at the city below. It was the same view he had from l'Etoile d'Or, but his perspective had irrevocably changed. He no longer saw a kingdom at his feet. He saw a complex, interconnected world that he had tried to dominate rather than understand. He thought of Charlotte, not with anger or jealousy anymore, but with a strange, hollow sense of awe. He pictured her in a boardroom at a whiteboard, sketching out equations that would change the world. She was finally in her element, unburdened by his ego. And Vincent Beaumont. He wasn't just a suitor. He was a partner who had seen her worth from the beginning, who hadn't needed her to be small, for him to feel big. Emery looked at the Ethelred wafer in his hand, then back at the city. His empire was crumbling, his fortune was diminished, his reputation was in tatters. He had lost everything he thought was important. And in that moment of absolute loss, a strange, terrifying, and yet liberating thought surfaced. He had spent 2 decades building Nexus innovations. It was his life's work. Now it was failing. But the technology inside it, the core ideas, had always been a joint effort. He had a choice. He could fight clinging to the wreckage of his pride and go down in flames, or he could finally acknowledge the truth. He walked to his desk, placed the wafer down gently, and opened his laptop. He began to type, not to his lawyers or his board, but an email to the one person who would understand. He didn't know if she would even read it. But he had to write it. It was a message he should have sent 20 years ago. It began with 3 simple words. You were right. Emery Whitlock's story is a powerful reminder that the true value of a person can never be measured by money or status. He thought he had discarded something simple, only to find out he had thrown away the very blueprint for the future. He looked at his ex-wife Charlotte and saw the past, while she was busy building a new world he couldn't even comprehend. It's a tale of arrogance, karma, and the quiet, unstoppable power of a brilliant mind finally given the freedom to soar. What he lost wasn't just his company or his fortune. He lost the chance to be a part of something truly revolutionary, all because his ego wouldn't let him see the genius sitting right next to him. What do you think, was this karma, or was it simply the inevitable outcome of underestimating someone so profoundly? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of ambition and consequence, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story of epic revenge, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will leave you thinking. Thanks for listening.